Welcome to our MOOC Introduction to Sociology 2, and today we shall be discussing George Herbert Mead and his take on interactionism. Let us introduce ourselves with George Herbert Mead, who he was and how he went on to develop his theory of symbolic interactionism. George Herbert Mead was a significantly well-known sociologist and a social philosopher. George Herbert Mead received his second BA degree in philosophy and Greek in the University of Harvard. And Mead later on went on to teach at the University of Michigan for the long 2 years. It was at this University of Michigan that George Herbert Mead met two extremely significant sociologists and philosophers of his time that are obviously Dewey and Cooley. Dewey is very well known for his wonderful understanding of human perspective that he went on to write while writing on Cooley's looking glass self and looking glass image. Now, like Cooley, Mead taught at the University of Michigan in the Department of Philosophy for a long time until his death in 1931. Now, let us come to George Herbert Mead's essential points or the components of his theory. Mead published various articles in his lifetime concerning immigration, settlement, house, women's suffrage, labor, education, and democracy. As we see that George Herbert Mead was a versatile writer and he wrote on various topics ranging from suffrage to immigration. But we must remember that all those were articles and not the books. So he was mainly writing articles for the audience around him, rather the readers around him. Mead's very famous book was Mind, Self and Society, that was published posthumously, gathered by his lecture notes of his students, and the book shall remain the chief source of the component of Mead's theory. As we said, that during his lifetime and his tenure, Mead was essentially writing articles and not books. What is very interesting, do you know, that it was his students, his very earnest students and his followers who went on to do a great job after he died. They collected all his college notes, university notes, and they gathered and compiled them into a book, which came to be known to us as one of the important contributions of George Herbert Mead. That is Mind, Self and Society, which is known as a Bible of symbolic interactionism, the new theory that was about to be proposed by George Herbert Mead. Now we shall be discussing the four basic components of George Herbert Mead, and they were self, self-interaction, development of self, and obviously symbolic meaning. Now, what is self and how did Mead go about it? Let's find out. His view of self is central to symbolic interactionism and self as an acting organism and not a passive receptacle that simply receives and responds to the stimuli. Mead stresses on people's ability through the mechanism of self-interaction to form and guide their own conduct. Let me tell you that Mead was one individual who went on to say that self is very invigorating, self improvises, and self is creative. And self is central to the understanding of symbolic interactionism. Because individual is not a mere receptacle of the stimulus that he receives, but he responds and reacts very vigorously and spontaneously to the stimuli around him. Therefore, Mead went on to say that self is central to our understanding, and self is not something which is just acted upon. It is something which has a lot of vigor and a lot of energy because it creates on its own self. It interprets, it reads out the cues that it receives from the others. It is not something which is very mundane or very bland or blunt. It is something which must throw back and reverse back in its actions because it has a lot to interpret and understand. Therefore, individuals act on their own environment, and in so doing, they create the objects which they attach meaning to. He therefore thoroughly distinguishes between things and objects. We must remember here that George Herbert Mead said that there is a basic difference between the thing and the object. What is thing? Something which has an inherent meaning in itself and something which cannot be interpreted from outside. But even when we were discussing about the basic tenets of symbolic interactionism, we said that individuals attach a subjective meaning to the item that he talks to. And therefore, this is what makes self more receptive and more invigorating and more introspective, because we don't take things on the gross value, but we try to attach an individual meaning to the item that we are associated with. Let's distinguish, according to George Herbert Mead, what is the difference between the thing and an object. Things are stimuli that exist prior to an individual of the individual, and therefore stimuli are prior to and independent of the individual. Things remain passive items before people learn to act on them. As I've already told you before, that things are absolutely mundane things, and they are non-receptive, and they are non-challenged in the sense that they cannot receive things. They already have an embedded meaning within themselves, and therefore they cannot be acted upon. They have a meaning that is inherent within itself, and people cannot attach a separate meaning to it. Once individual learns to interpret it, once individual learns to bring forth a subjective meaning to that particular item, it becomes converted into an object. Now let's see what objects are. Objects exist only in relation to the act, and things are converted to objects to the acts of the individual. Because as I said, that things are inherent and they have a meaning within themselves which are taken for granted. Only when individual acts on them, only when individual interprets them and gives a subjective meaning to it, that the meaning changes. And therefore, the item changes from the thing to an object because of human interaction and people giving it a subjective meaning. Wallace and Woolf, if you go into that book, because I think it is one of the basic books of symbolic interactionism, you will see how he gives the example of a tomato. A tomato is usually an item, a thing, because it may not have a separate meaning attached to it. It is just something which is eaten and something which is kept just like that. But how people will interpret the meaning of tomato, that changes. When you eat it, when you sumptuously eat it, when you devour it, when you take it as a tomato ketchup, or you take it as a salad, or you add tomato quite handsomely to any food item that you're preparing, any recipe that you are, preparing, rustling up for your family. It is an object of nourishment. It's an object of marination. But suddenly, if you're angry about something, it's a kind of a massive agitation, a public anger, and you start throwing tomato to the people who are there and against whom you have a lot of grievances, against whom you have a lot of anger to express, and you want to throw off your grudges, your grievances, all the stored up feelings that you have within yourself. So see how tomato changes its meaning. From being an item of nourishment, from being an item of marination and salad, it gets transformed into an object of anger, of stigma, of agitation, of insult and humiliation. This is how Mead wanted to stress that things are inherent things which has a meaning for itself, but human have the capacity, self has the capacity to change the meaning of a thing so that it can be converted into an object. And a thing changes into object only if the meaning attached to it becomes different, and we should be able to recognize the different meaning that has been attached to it. Individual and the self are the only people who can give and render the significant meaning to that particular thing so that it can be converted into an object. The tomato was just a bland thing, as I said, and it is the social actors that transform them from things into objects. And therefore, Mead's person is more creative, more vigorous, more interactive, more improvising, and more flexible Then the functionalist idea of self, which is more structured, more organized, more determined, and talks about a lot of determinations where there is no scope for sudden changes or spontaneous vibrations. Next will come to Mitt's differentiation of self and how he differentiates between the different layers of the self. Mitt pronounces that self can be outlined into two phases. Now, what are the two phases? These two phases are I and me. This differentiation makes self more dynamic and less deterministic, as I've already said. When you're talking about functionalism, it's all about, a fixture, a permanent straitjacket thing, where there's no scope for vigorous change or sudden incorporations. But when you're going for symbolic interactionism, be it especially because of George Herbert Mead, we find a lot of juxtapositions and a lot of changes. This assumes that self is not consolidated whole, but something which is differentiated, something which can be sliced, and something which can be layered. We'll come to the difference between I and me. See, the basic difference between I and me is I is very spontaneous, what I have within myself, and I don't hide it. It is what I feel like and I speak it out. I'm speaking my mind. So it's just like a child who throws a lot of tempers, who throws a lot of whims and tantamounts, and he's a lot of a fuzzy person, especially a very small child who is so whimsical, So you always go on throwing his temper. So that is a kind of I which is very unorganized but very spontaneous. It speaks its own mind and doesn't hide his own emotions and true sentiments. But whenever we come and talk about me, it is far more organized, it is far more planned, it's far more orchestrated, it is far more intuitive, and it's far more thoughtful because it goes into an imaginative rehearsal. It doesn't speak all at one go, but there's a thought process going into it. I'm given a stimulus, I won't just jump into it. That's a basic difference between the animal and man, because animals do not go for interpretations, they do not go for imaginative rehearsals. You give the dog a slice of bread or say a chicken, a leg of chicken, he will jump on it without realizing whether it is poisonous for itself or whether it is a bait being given to it. That is the reason we have a lot of dogs dying, a lot of animals dying that way, because they are just given a bait. But for human beings, we don't pounce upon the object we are getting just because it's so yummy we need to have the chicken, or it's so yummy we need to eat this particular thing. Whenever we are served something, we'll think for a while, should we consume it? Is it good for our health? What is the social context into which we are eating it? Maybe we have gone for a wedding ceremony for match fixing and somebody gives a dish full of sweets. Should we consume the whole, or should we think no, we need to do it with judiciousness, since we have come to a very important place where everything matters, so you need to be judicious. Maybe you love those sweets a lot, but then you have to be thoughtful about it. So let's come to the differences one by one. I is unorganized response of the organism to the attitudes of the others. As I said, me is the set of organized attitudes of others that the individual himself assumes in turn. It is a spontaneous disposition or the impulse to act. So I, being very impulsive, I act on whatever it has on its hand. It doesn't give it a second thought. Whereas when he or she bears upon himself or herself those perspectives that are learned from the others, and the attitude of the others constitute the organized me, and then one reacts to that as an I. So I have to keep within myself, I have to work upon the attitudes of others, because that is important. The perspectives are very important, which is not there for I. But me has a lot of, before thoughts and after thoughts. So it takes its course of action very carefully. The incalculable spontaneity of I allows for a certain degree of innovation and creativity, as well as a degree of freedom, because it is not being dictated by somebody. I takes its decision on its own self. It doesn't depend upon anybody else. So when you take your decision upon yourself and you're being very spontaneous and very impulsive, for instance, you want to go for a profession which your parents don't want. You want to go for, say, piano, or you want to go for Western music, which your parents will never approve of. But then also that gives you a lot of freedom, because you're taking your own course of action, irrespective of whether your parents or your other mentors approve of it or not. So this is the I thing, where you don't think of the, the future prospects or your later courses of action. So we had been saying that there is an essential difference between I and me. As I said, that I is the acting individual, which, acts without taking into consideration the cues it receives from the other places. Whereas the me is acted upon. It is acting upon what? No, it is acting upon the cues, the perspectives, the opinions, the feedbacks that it gets from the others. So me is far more organized, far more authoritarian, and far more orchestrated in its move, whereas I is far more spontaneous. Mead says that whenever social interaction takes place, it tries to follow a beaten track, but it doesn't always happen because there can be certain changes and sudden changes which makes people baffled. And they suddenly they do lose track of what they had been doing, and suddenly life goes out of gear. And this Mead says is nothing but a kind of paradigm shift, which is more clearly pronounced by Kuhn. Mead gives social scientists a perspective that enables them to analyze certain behaviors. Such behaviors are unstructured and not affected by previously established conventions, and such behaviors may indicate what we had been saying as paradigm change. So certain behaviors which can happen absolutely out from the blue and about which we suddenly have no knowledge. So these are the unstructured behaviors that Mead was trying to propose. Thomas Kuhn, yet another sociologist and a very famous person of the time, especially of the interactionist domain. And Kuhn defines paradigm as universally recognized scientific achievements that for a time offer model problems and solutions to a community of practitioners. And any change in it may meet considerable resistance all the time. A sudden discovery like Roentgen's accidental discovery of X-rays can be drastic. Such discoveries necessitate paradigm change and focus us to perceive that something has happened that our paradigm is not ready to accept. So Roentgen had been talking about a kind of sudden discovery of X-ray, which he had not thought of before. So such discoveries can be sudden, and people may not be very ready or prepared to accept such changes. And what happens then? Such discoveries can suddenly happen if our paradigm is not ready to accept what we are giving. And such discoveries go against the idea of a normal science, which does not aim at novelties of factor theory. When one discovers something by chance, far away the established ideas or convention, self-interaction becomes very important. Because self-interaction happens only when we are indicating something to ourselves, which is something away from the oddity, or something away from what we have perceived or what we have thought of or what we had actually planned of. So any kind of unplanned action, any kind of unstructured action, any kind of action which is unplanned or uncalled for, at that particular time, self-interactions, self-interpretations and self-conversation becomes very important. Because you're trying to take into consideration certain things which is outside your parameters, which is not usually within the constraints or boundaries of the normal science. Something which you were not familiar with or something which you were not very much aware of. The internal conversations. Now, what are internal conversations? Internal conversations like you will also be having it. No. Girls and boys, everybody. And I think internal conversations are happening everywhere around us. Suddenly, suppose someone's father died, and we are going in order to deliver our condolence at that particular place. And the entire family is so shocked and they don't know how to react. Even we don't know what to go and tell them there. So it is the internal conversations which we always go through. The internal conversations that one has with oneself are an essential part of median perspective, and conversations are the means by which human beings take part and they take into account and organize themselves. Self-interaction is also the basis for role-taking. This is very important, and role-taking is when you are putting yourself in the shoes of the other, when you're trying to understand his or her positions quite adequately, because otherwise you won't be able to respond to that situation. As I say, somebody's father died. And then you will have to understand that his background, the background he belonged to. Maybe father was the only breadwinner of the family, and with the demise of the father, the entire family shatters. And unless and until you know about his situation, you know about him very well, you won't be able to put yourself in the shoes of that particular man. So you have to be very vigorous, you have to be very vibrant, and you must be able to take stock knowledge of that particular individual. Otherwise, you will not be able to understand his situation, and unless and until you are able to rehearse and imagine his situation, you won't be able to quip out or deliver out a very a very nice conversation or a very suitable dialogue. So let's find out what is role taking. Communication is a process whereby each person takes the role of the other, and each person assumes the attitude of the other individual as calling it out to the other. This would not be possible with self-interaction. Role taking emphasizes the importance of individuals putting themselves in the shoes of the other, and this can be both exciting and influencing. And whenever you're going for role taking, you are able to come back on himself and direct his own process of communication. It also underlines the control which the individual exert. As I have already said, that whenever individual goes for role taking, it's a kind of an imaginative rehearsal, it's a kind of a process of acting, it's a kind of a performance on the stage. You're not your real self. So whenever you go to an individual's house and you pray for the departed soul, and you sit with the people and give a lot of condolences, speak very nice words, but then when you come back to your own house, you're again your own normal self. So it is also, you're able to manipulate your own self. You're able to make your own self very malleable and ductile. We often talk to ourselves in daily context. For instance, we do it to approach a certain situation, of whether to confront it or not. We actually rehearse for future action. This helps us to take the role of the others, and as I've already said, that conversations and internal conversations always go on within yourself. Whenever you're trying to figure out what the other person is trying to say and how to go about a particular course of action, because you want to be perfect, you want to be extremely orchestrated in your own actions, and therefore whenever you want to jump into a action, you are preparing yourself. So it's a kind of a preparatory stage that every self goes through. Human act is formed through self-interaction, and such an action, the actor may note and assess any feature of the situation. So self-interaction channelizes one's actions irrespective of whether it has been done intelligently or stupidly. When I subject my act to the process of self-interaction, I get to decide my future course of my action. This is whether the act may be stopped, it may be terminated, it may be continued, it may be planned, it may be changed, it may be terminated altogether. So when you're going for self-interaction, I'm not saying that every self-interaction you're able to infer the situation very cleverly or intelligently or very witfully. But what you do is, you actually have to have a creativity within yourself, and you plan your own course of action. This is very unlike the functionalist approach, which I've already said before, where individuals are nothing but like puppets in the hands of the society. It is a society which moves them. It is a society which directs their own course of action. But whenever we are into interactionism, we are far more vigorous, far more interactive, and far more spontaneous, and it is we acting upon the perspective of others and cues of the others that decide our future course of action. Now, the development of self goes through 3 stages. The I, as I said, me, but those were the distinct perspectives, the divisions of the self. The stages that we are talking about, those are pre-play stage, another is the play stage, and lastly is the game stage. What happens in the pre-play stage, it is usually very small children, babies, toddlers, they go through this pre-play stage where they're on their own, and then need not take into cognition the attitudes of the others or the perspectives of the others or the cues of the others. Whereas in the play stage, like they are little grown up now, they can understand what the others are feeling, that others too have a role to play. But what happens, you're not able to take the role of the other that significantly. It is only in the game stage that self become more matured and more evolved, and therefore you can take upon the role of the others because you're able to conform with the social standards and act according to strictures of the society. Let's find out the differences. Pre-play stage starts at age 2. Whereas the second stage is a play stage which marks a late childhood, and now we enter the game stage where several players are in action together. Remember, in pre-play, I myself is more important. Myself hasn't evolved to that point, and therefore I as an individual is more important. Play stage, where some people are important to me, but I cannot really assume their roles, nor do I understand that what their indications are towards me and how to take upon their perspectives. It is marked by meaningless and imitative acts. The child puts himself in the shoes of the other but cannot relate to the roles of the other player. For example, the children, when small, scold their toys for being bad or dirty, but they really cannot go into the role playing, because they cannot talk for the toys. They are doing the talking themselves only. Not many individuals are involved here. So the role taking is not possible. I can only imitate others. I can only, give some instructions to others. I can understand what others may feel like, but I cannot really take their place. I cannot act on their behalf and give me certain cues, nor can I accept their cues. Now, game stage happens in a more complex and organized game where more and more team players are involved, and when the game becomes more complicated and more complex because more of the social actors are getting involved here. Now, play stage is meaningless for the child lacks the ability to take the attitude of the others, but in the game stage, the participants must anticipate the attitudes of the others. For example, in a baseball or a bridge game, where the player must understand the next move of the team met and act accordingly in order to win the game, because he understands what the society expects of them. And therefore, the generalized other is the organized attitude of the community. You want to distinguish between the significant other and the generalized other. And in the play stage, children were acting out others' part and simple role, and they were playing maybe the teacher's role, and maybe they were playing the hide and seek. So they are not able to understand the role of the significant other. They are more interested with the generalized other. So, rather, in the play stage, when the children play a game, it is important that they understand only the actions of the significant others. Now, who are the significant others? The teachers or their peers or their parents with whom they have daily communication. But when we move into game stage, we want to assume the attitudes, the moralities, and the absolute collective conscience of the whole society. It is where my generalized other becomes more important. So it is also how Mead brings out the distinction between the significant other and the generalized other. As I've said that, what are gestures? Gestures are nothing but, signals, but they become significant symbols once the meaning is assumed by the people and universal meaning is proposed and assumed by all. For instance, just a cigarette box, it is nothing. But when I'm approaching for a cigarette box, maybe the people sitting in my room in front of me, they will become aware that I am a cigarette smoker and they will move out of the room. So cigarette has a particular significant symbol within itself, and therefore my gesture becomes significant. So this particular item has a kind of meaning within itself which is recognized by everybody, and then people act upon it. So gesture becomes transformed into a significant symbol. Let's find out. The gesture is the first component of the act, and he does not need to see the whole process of the act. Thus, reaching out for a cigarette is a significant symbol and not just a gesture. Such gestures call out the meaning of the entire act and signals the beginning of his or her adjustment to it. Gestures, when internalized, become significant symbols because having the same meanings for all. So unless gesture becomes, internalized and presumed by all other members of the society, they stop being significant symbols. Unless it is not happening, significant symbols won't happen. Symbol is a stimulus where response is given in advance. For example, someone curses you and you knock him down. For it, you are taking the attitude of the community and responding to it in a conversation of gestures. A key element is the meaning of the word and becomes a stimulus. And the community in question, the connotations of the word and the intentions implied by its use evoke a blow. As I said, that somebody cursing me, somebody bad-mouthing me, and I knock the person down. That word has a meaning to me, which is very different from the others, and something which has been used in a very sordid manner, something which has been used in a very scornful way, and we understand the word and its meaning, and therefore it becomes a symbol. Now consider the case of Helen Keller, and this supposedly is one of the most important examples of symbolic interactionism. Let's go about it. She gets into communication with others through symbols which could arouse in herself the responses they arouse in other people that she could get. This we call a mental content or a self. Let us recall the scene in Helen Keller's life in which her friend and a teacher, Annie Sullivan, is pumping the water, and Helen could feel the running water. She understands what the gesture for water means. And this excellent example of symbolic communication, when Helen Keller is all deaf, blind and mute, she cannot see, she cannot speak, she cannot hear what other people are saying around her. But certain, the touch of the hand, and certain bodily gestures give her certain feelings that is still visible to her, even if she has lost her faculties of her five senses. This is what we say as gestures becoming significant symbols, where you can interpret and attach meaning to it, and you can role take, and when you have a conversation within yourself, that is what happens in the kind of a self. When self becomes, as Mead has said, self is imaginative, self is open, and self is more and more accommodative. It can take into considerations many actions, even if they are structured and pre-structured. So let's celebrate the power and empowerment and the vigorousness of the self. Thank you.